edition of the Arts and Humanities Faculty Lecture Series this year. I know it's a snowy night out there, and we appreciate you braving the weather to come out and hear our speaker this evening. So tonight's speaker, we have Dr. Chris Gittings, and he teaches in the Film Studies Department at Western. His research interests and publications include work on gender and sexuality, genre, national cinemas, race, popular culture, television, and cultural studies. He is the author of Canadian National Cinema, Ideology, Difference, and Representation, and the editor of Imperialism and Gender, Constructions of Masculinity. And this evening, he's going to present Sites of Spectrality, Remembering and Forgetting RMS Titanic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Gittings.
Now again, I'll just kind of echo Joe's sentiments. Thanks a lot for coming out to hear me crap on about things Titanic on such a kind of inhospitable evening. I really appreciate it. And I've tried to thin it down and make it briefer, but as you'll gather from, as the paper develops, with things Titanic, they just keep growing in the sense that there's one more weird product, one more, intriguing and strange cultural site every year. So I had a lot to kind of thin down, and I hope I've kind of got its essence. It runs about 45 minutes to maybe 50. So if you're bored and you want to leave, I won't be offended at all. I really won't. I won't be offended. So, tonight I'm going to share with you some thoughts on how and why Titanic continues to haunt popular culture and cultural memory. I first started thinking critically about Titanic's continual spectral return when I was teaching in the UK and attended the initial exhibition of Titanic Wreckage at the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich. I'd been obsessed with Titanic since childhood. I read Walter Lord's A Night to Remember when I was 10, so I think there is a certain morbid inflection to people's interests about Titanic. So I myself have sought many of the cultural sites out that I'm going to talk about. So what follows, I don't want it to come across as a kind of smart-ass attempt to point a finger at lesser beings who don't fully understand why they are drawn to all things Titanic, as much as it is a struggle to interrogate my own kind of lifelong interest in Titanic in the context of other people's investments in Titanic. So part of my thinking around what I'm calling haunting is, or the spectral return that I mentioned, it's influenced by, at my peril, French philosopher Jacques Derrida and his ideas about the specter. So bear with me for a moment as I attempt to unpack Derrida. I promise I'll try and elucidate it and make it clear. At the beginning it might seem a bit overly theory jargon ridden, but I'll try and dispel that soon. Apparitions of Titanic are frequently generated in the name of preserving or even restoring cultural memory, whilst simultaneously and ironically causing its disappearance. Drawing on Jacques Derrida's concept of spectrality, I want to analyze the spectral return of Titanic, its haunting of cultural memory through various sites of popular culture, such as tabloid journalism, venture capital projects that seek to rebuild the ship, the publicly traded RMS Titanic Inc. artifact exhibitions, cinema, board and computer games, a watch that's surprisingly and unlikely manufactured from the ship's wreckage, and the centenary memorial cruise that happened this past April of 2012. In short, I'm suggesting that the various myths of Titanic that come back to us as specters work to deform the ship and the tragic events of April 14, 1912 into cultural memories that take a commodity form. Oops. Jacques Derrida's questions about spectrality and specters of Marx concern the work of mourning and Marx's communism's haunting of the social. I'm not going to get into that too much, but that's where I'm taking this idea from. I want to adapt the critical lens of Derrida as a way of viewing Titanic's appearances in culture and society. For Derrida, the work of mourning, quote, consists always in attempting to ontologize remains, to make them present in the first place by identifying the bodily remains and by localizing the dead, close quote. So I'll draw on Derrida's understanding of mourning and spectrality as a way of reading what he calls a hauntology of the Titanic. So this haunting structure that inflects how we see Titanic in popular culture. So the questions for me are, how in a range of cultural sites do various representations, various simulations of the ship haunt the social? Well, many of the cultural formations of Titanic that I'm going to discuss gesture toward making bodily remains present, ontologizing, to use Derrida's term. They collapse into a haunting, or his term, a hauntology. They provide their consumers with misrecognitions, or what Derrida might term performative interpretations. Interpretations that transform the very things they interpret. So I'm just about through the kind of jargon and the wordplay, but this idea of interpreting the very things, transforming the various things that they're trying to interpret that Derrida talks about, I'll give you an example. So this idea of misrecognition, I think, can be explained here. For example, some people willfully misrecognize James Cameron's film for actual events. And I said willfully do this, right? They mistake fictional characters like Jack and Rose for historical figures, even though, of course, they know that this is not the case. But I'll point to examples as I go on where people actually do this. In this image, on the left, a passenger on the April 2012 Memorial Cruise mimics the famous scene from the motion picture. In this performative way, she transforms the very things she is trying to remember or interpret, the Titanic and the events surrounding the disaster, because she's mapping Cameron's fiction on top of them. Addressing the limits of misrecognition, Slovenian philosopher and cultural critic Slavoj Žižek offers the wreck of the Titanic as the rock of the real, suspending misrecognition, that which always resists symbolization. So he's saying that you can only misrecognize for so long, the violence of the wreck is always going to return, of the tragedy. So he writes, the traumatic point which is always missed, but nonetheless always returns, although we try, through a set of different strategies, to neutralize it, to integrate it into the symbolic order. So the suggestion here is that we develop ways of integrating the traumatic event that was Titanic into various symbolic meanings, deliberately misrecognizing it so that we can have it make sense, so that it becomes meaningful to us in our present moment. These different neutralizing strategies constitute misrecognitions, the types of attempted symbolic work that critics like Stephen Beale and Richard Howells track in their studies of the cultural meanings that have been attributed to Titanic since it sunk. So Beale considers the divergent significations of Titanic produced by various groups, such as African Americans who have a whole folk culture about the Titanic and what it meant for them at the time. Suffragettes and how they used the Titanic symbolically in discourse to represent their plight. Socialists and capitalists. So similarly, this guy's colleague Howells examines the process by which these narratives construct cultural meaning or myth out of what is an arbitrary event that then they bend to make sense for themselves. As Žižek argues, the, quote, knot of meanings, close quote, associated with Titanic overdetermines it symbolically, thereby repressing, on one hand, the symbolic of the violence of the wreck. Following Roland Barthes' understanding of myth and its relationship to meaning, the various myths of Titanic that come back to us as specters or ghosts work to deform the ship and the tragic events of April 14, 1912 into cultural memories. Now, before I focus in some detail on specific sites of Titanic specters and culture, the ghostly return of the ship, I want to look very briefly at media contributions to Titanic, hauntology, that, to borrow a phrase from Jean-Luc Nancy, invoke myths that designate the absence of what they name. So the ship, they're designating what they're naming the ship, but then the ship just disappears because of the myth that they're filling the space of the ship with and actually covering it up. And I'll tell you, hopefully, what I mean by this through this next example. I'm going to go to that bastion of documentary truth. I hope many of you are familiar with it. The Weekly World News tabloid published a series of stories, not surprisingly, about a 21st century recovery of human remains from Titanic. This is alongside stories about the afterlife of Elvis and, Princess Diana, that kind of thing. So the tabloid invented cultural memories in this process that tell us really more about our present concerns with race and our relationship to the past than they do about Titanic itself, as you can see from the headline. In the headline, shocking discovery reveals real reason real reason ship sank. KKK skeletons found in Titanic life ring. The wreck of the Titanic here is enlisted to perform specific cultural work. Here, the racist foundations of American nation resurface to haunt the present and inflect seemingly unrelated past events with a specifically American resonance and significance. The story, filed by Michael Sharon, claims that drunken Ku Klux Klan kingpins caused the Titanic to collide with an iceberg when their on-deck cross-burning antics distracted a lookout who abandoned his post to extinguish the fire. A photograph of two skeletons wearing the tattered remains of KKK hoods and clutching a charred cross while they float in a Titanic life ring is deployed to substantiate the story. In case the reader has any doubts concerning the credibility of such a story, academic authority is invoked in the person of Troy Benoit, a British Titanic scholar and director of something called the Titanic Human Remains Reclamation Project. Benoit says that the remains of Titanic survivors some 90 years after the disaster is becoming, quote, a bit old hat, close quote. Sharon, supposedly drawing on his interview with Benoit, tells his readers, quote, experts now believe that after the disaster, many of the life rings became trapped in a sprawling ice floe and were stuck there for decades. As the ice melted, the corpses were set adrift. There's a series of stories about babies being found in life rings alive, and the ship, appears out of the mist. And what's interesting, if you kind of troll in these Titanic websites, like Titanica, for example, people talk about these stories and they say, oh, how ridiculous. But everybody in one of these threads says, but people believe this kind of crap. So there's some kind of investment that somebody out there believes it, whether they do or not. So the veracity of this ludicrous claim is a moot point. What interests me really is the story's performative interpretation of Titanic through mourning. Its attempt, in Derrida's language, to make remains present, gesturing toward the recovery of actual bodies by naming these KKK bodies into being through journal entries and other manufactured documentary evidence unearthed by what masquerades as investigative journalism. Sharon's article collapses into what I'm calling, after Derrida, a hauntology, these bodiless media ghosts of the Titanic that misrecognize its sinking as signs of a U.S. white supremacy that helped, apparently, set the stage for World War II. Sharon and Benoit report that the Klansmen in question had been touring Europe to disseminate their racist ideology, and in the process founded an Aryan organization known as the Tula Society, a precursor, they claim, of the Nazi Party. In this US-centric narrative move, American white supremacy is remembered or represented as the historical antecedent of German National Socialism, a history hitherto concealed by the grave of the Titanic. Who knew? So thank God for these kinds of investigative, intrepid journalists. So next I want to talk about venture capital and Titanic markets. The specter is, as Derrida writes, a revenant. It's a ghost. It begins by coming back. That's its very beginning, its return. The tabloid site of one of the more extreme returns I'm going to deal with, as you can imagine. But it also signals the scope of the ship's resonance in cultural memory. Moving away from the excesses of American tabloid journalism, I really want to talk now about British quality broadsheets, where we can locate a different kind of excess in the reports of other returns, specifically the excesses of commodity. In a November 1994 front page article, The Independent on Sunday stated that the details of a plan for a Japanese film to build a full-size replica of Titanic as a floating hotel and conference center. A spokesman for Mcdowell Marine, the company that designed the interiors of the proposed Spectral Titanic, reveals how this fantasy vessel would return. Quote, "It will be full scale, exactly like the original, except that there will be no engines or steering mechanism," close quote. Further aberrations from the original include a 4-story exhibition hall in place of the boiler rooms and the elimination of third-class cabins. In this ship that cannot go anywhere, we find an engineless engine for the production of money that erases third class, thereby absenting the nodal point of social class that structures so many cultural memories of Titanic due to the large deaths of third-class passengers, more so than anybody else on the ship. The £100 million of capital investment required to initiate construction on the first-class fantasy ship, what it serves to do is empty Titanic of class conflict, but it reinscribes class privilege by commodifying a nostalgia for luxury and class-derived entitlement. There is another attempt by venture capital to reproduce the Titanic. A £360 million replica of Titanic was proposed by RMS Titanic Shipping Holdings Limited, and it marks another return that gets rid of third class, dispatches it from the fantasy. A December 2000 Observer story reports that the ship, to be known as Titanic II, will charge from $1,500 to $15,000 US for 1 week's passage. Unlike the Japanese version of the Titanic, Titanic II would be a working cruise ship and would be larger and heavier than the original Titanic. These two bodiless bodies of Titanic, they were never built, were greeted with condemnation by Titanic survivor Millvina Dean, who we'll hear a bit about later. She painted this as a travesty and said she was very pained by what she saw as the blatant exploitation of tragedy for profit. How can a death ship return as a pleasure ship? How does that work? It would seem there is a pleasure derived from consuming death as a commodity, a transaction that one can survive. The backers of Titanic II not only trade on the original Titanic's association with death in their appropriation of the name Titanic, they also attempt to develop a currency with their prospective market through a design that would integrate recovered artifacts from the wreckage of the original into the structure of the proposed new vessel as a permanent museum. So they're going to have these huge columns that spanned all the decks of the ship filled with seawater with wreckage in them. So as you went on your cruise on Titanic II, you would be sharing space with the wreckage of Titanic I. In this way, what Zizek refers to as a kind of petrified forest of enjoyment, the wreckage of Titanic, or after Zizek, the materialization of the terrifying, is once again misrecognized in this attempt to domesticate it. At £360 million, Titanic II is a sign not only for unparalleled luxury and class privilege in a contemporary symbolic order, but for capital itself, much as the original functioned in an Edwardian symbolic order. Three of the most successful capitalists of the age, J.P. Morgan, who headed the American conglomerate that owned the White Star Line, Benjamin Guggenheim, and J.J. Astor, are forever associated with the original Titanic. The spectral return of Titanic in Titanic II conjures the return of the Edwardian robber baron class in the grandees of 21st century globalization, who, according to press reports, were tripping over themselves trying to book passage on the fantasy ship. Titanic II invites early 21st century robber barons to make identifications with Morgan, Guggenheim, and Astor. However, if Titanic is a sign of capital itself, it is simultaneously a sign of capitalist death. Morgan, Guggenheim, and Astor are forever associated with Titanic because they were lost with it. As Beale notes in his Cultural History of the Titanic Disaster, socialists in 1912 read the sinking of the Titanic and the loss of men like Morgan allegorically, as an indictment of the status quo. Through Titanic, they gazed upon what they saw as capitalism as a sinking ship. The death of capitalism, however, is a death that never arrives. In 2012, Australian billionaire Clive Palmer incorporated the Blue Star Line and signed a letter of understanding with the Chinese shipyard to construct a full-size replica of Titanic, to be called, of course, Titanic II. So this would be Titanic, the second Titanic II. The version, if it's ever built, will include third class this time. But with 40,000 applications for a berth, including some bids in the $1 million range, this will be a floating theme park of third class experience. And another really interesting point is a lot of these, the Centenary cruise and this particular, the Blue Star Line, as Palmer calls his company, they're really interested in completing the journey. They want to bring Titanic back to New York. And we'll talk a bit about that later. As much as death might be represented by consumers of the signed Titanic, it is also a pleasure that it's secretly and not so secretly sought out by people interested in the ship. Hence the proposed inclusion of the artifacts of the death ship on the pleasure ship Titanic II 13 years ago. The value of objects identified with Titanic resides partly, as Todd Gronberg observes, quote, in their association with death, end quote. Gronberg's point was impressed upon me when I visited the 1994 British National Maritime Museum exhibit, The Wreck of the Titanic, where I viewed the clothing, toiletry articles, luggage, unsent letters, and unsmoked hand-rolled cigarettes of the dead. These objects create slippages between themselves and the bodies of their owners. The personal items I observed in the Learning from the Titanic, A Lost World Found section of the exhibit stood in for the lives that have been lost. As the museum's press kit describes this section, quote, such articles from the wreck help reconstruct life on board the ship, end quote. The museum's director, Sir Richard Ormond, states that through the objects in the exhibition, quote, the memory of those who died may live on, close quote. These statements, taken together with the personal objects, constitute attempts to make remains present. Inevitably, these gestures toward presence, through acts of spectating remembrance, collapse into a haunting, collapse into spectrality, and point to a lack of bodily remains. So this work reflects what Hyson sees as the fundamental dialectic of the museum as an institution. He says, quote, it serves both as a burial chamber of the past, with all that entails in terms of decay, erosion, forgetting, and as the site of possible resurrections, however mediated and contaminated in the eyes of the beholder, close quote. So this dialectic of forgetting and remembering, I would argue, is at the heart of all cultural resurrections of Titanic. It's remembering and forgetting continually in play. Gronberg makes a similar observation in his reading of the exhibit's Preserving the Artifacts section, where he argues, quote, conservation techniques are presented as a means of bringing objects, quote, back to life. He's quoting from the actual exhibit text. Moreover, Gronberg argues that these resurrection narratives engage the viewer's fear of death. Writing about the viewer's relationship to the museum, Hyson touches on an understanding of the past that lends instructive insights, I think, into our consideration of the return of Titanic from the past to our present. Quote, it enables moderns to negotiate and to articulate a relationship to the past that is always also a relationship to the transitory and to death, our own included. Close quote. The sought and repressed pleasure of consuming death, remembering and forgetting, that structures our encounters with Titanic, with the past, can be located in the narrative trajectory of the exhibit. So the show begins with the ship intact. It's a nice model. And then you go around a corner and you see some footage of survivors, newsreel footage. And then you come to a large-scale diorama of the wreckage on the ocean floor. And mixed in with that wreckage, this is a model of the wreck, but mixed in with that model are actual pieces of the ship that have been brought to the surface by RMS Titanic Inc. And that's who's supplying the British Maritime Museum with the materials. So as you work your way through, though, the ship gets put back together. And so by the time you exit, you're looking again at a pristine Titanic. And the artifacts that you see are encrusted with salts. There's a lot of decay and erosion. And part of the self-reflexive nature of the exhibit shows you how the conservators undo the violence of the iceberg, how they forget what actually happened by using electrolysis to remove the sediment, to remove the salts. So as you're working your way through, you get past the violence, and then you see a pristine ship, and you even see pristine objects. So there's the service, dishes before, they get fixed up, and then here they are after, in their original state, supposedly. And this they did with jewelry, eyeglasses, portholes, lots of different objects that were found on the ocean floor. So this, as I said, works to undo the passage of time and the violence of the iceberg. The viewer is invited to participate in these acts of recovery through spectating, but also as a consumer in the Titanic boutique, because when you exit from this exhibit, you are exiting into a store before you can get out of the museum. And in the boutique, you can buy Titanic in its pre- and post-collision states. There are various commodified objects. So postcards, T-shirts, lapel buttons, models, coffee mugs, all solicit a commerce with death that you can survive. The pleasure in consuming death and surviving is marked expressly in one product. A T-shirt that's emblazoned with the words, and I can't find any of this on the net because it was pulled, so they must have taken every image down. Quote, "I survived the Titanic," and then in brackets, exhibition. This item, along with iceberg-shaped soap on a rope, was removed from the boutique shelves on the grounds of questionable taste. Taste, as National Maritime Museum worker Stephen Duker writes, was something that the British media found lacking in the prospect of the exhibit itself. It was attacked in the British media, and so was the Royal Maritime Museum. Many media reports suggest that the institution was complicit with the Selver RMS Titanic Incorporated in grave robbing. And then the argument was made, well, we go into Egyptian tombs, what's the difference? And people pointed out some of the differences in terms of the selling of images, but we can talk about that later if you want. These concerns were not misplaced. As the exhibit I saw, about taste anyway, the museum exhibit I saw at Greenwich, I ran into another version of it mounted by RMS Titanic. They have several, as you know, probably all around the world going at one time. Is there enough wreckage to disperse over all these different shows? It morphed into a touring Las Vegas-style spectacle that I caught up with in that city's Tropicana Casino in 2006. So very different from the kind of stately grounds of the Greenwich Maritime Museum and the kind of credibility that the Greenwich Maritime Museum has as a museum. Under the sole direction of RMS Titanic Incorporated, a publicly traded corporation, the excesses that were criticized by museum workers and the British press at Greenwich were given full rein in Las Vegas. And I think you can that's an iceberg wall. You can go and touch it. It's very cold. It's like ice, but it's not really ice. And you can see the text there as well. Here, patrons were invited to touch the ice wall, an artificial iceberg, and pose for photos, which I did, on a scale reconstruction of the ship's grand staircase, an architectural detail from the ship's interior, etched into a contemporary global popular imaginary through the production design of James Cameron's blockbuster film Titanic, as the set that frames the romantic and tragic lives of fictional characters Rose and Jack, played by Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio in the film. Although RMS Titanic Inc. continues to salvage from the grave of Titanic, the artifacts are distributed across simultaneous shows where they tend to be eclipsed by manufactured set pieces. So there's more manufactured set pieces often than there are actual artifacts. So this, in my way of thinking, renders the exhibit more like an Andrew Lloyd Webber theatrical franchise than a conventional museum exhibit, as the eclectic venues it plays around the world might suggest. Stockholm, it's all over the world, everywhere, but then look at the kinds of places it plays. And it is like it does play. I don't think it's really a museum exhibit. So in the summer of 2009, but you could go any year and see where it is, including now, the Minnesota Science Museum, Montreal's Eaton Center, Atlanta, Georgia's Aquarium, New York's Discovery Times Square exhibition, Lisbon's Espaço Rocio, and under the glass pyramid at Vegas's Luxor Hotel. So you can see the kind of juxtaposition that the Vegas, it's this commodification of death. It's all fantasy, but it's different types of fantasy, kind of in tension with each other. So central to any understanding of RMS Titanic Incorporated, their concept of the museum is, as a responsible cultural institution, is the knowledge I think we must have that the parent company, Premier Exhibitions Incorporated, describes itself as, quote, a major provider of museum quality touring exhibits. But it's also the capital behind such touring exhibits as Bodies, the exhibition, and Bodies Revealed, where cadavers preserved in liquid silicone are arranged in a variety of positions for educational purposes. Again, and there was a controversy about how they got their bodies, which I won't go into, but again, I would argue that the central motivator for this commerce with death is a sensational and morbid curiosity that sells tickets and keeps the financial return to the company's shareholders at a maximum. Further evidence that Premier privileges entertainment over education may be found in Star Trek, the exhibition, the company's touring display of props and memorabilia from the lucrative Hollywood franchise's television and movie properties. I'm not saying you can't do something educational with Star Trek. I think you probably can. But if you're just showing the props and not really drawing correlations between the fiction and what later came in technology, which some people have done, it's not, I would argue, very educational. Now, one of the more misguided blendings of the museum and the carnival, which I think this is Branson, Missouri's Titanic, world's largest museum attraction, which offers Titanic weddings with vows on a replica of the ship's grand staircase, and sells heart-shaped jewel pendants inspired by Cameron's film in its gift shop. Here, remembering is truly forgetting. In Branson, the unfortunate and unintended irony of the advertising copy for the museum's Titanic wedding makes it all too clear that remembering is forgetting. With the, you can see this, the copy there, happily ever after begins at Titanic. This romantic spectacle is integrated with what the business's website terms 400 valuable museum artifacts. The Branson, Missouri attraction is essentially a knockoff of what RMS Titanic Incorporated does. It has, you know, a grand staircase, it has an ice wall. It's basically the same kind of show. Now, to put these commercial ventures into context, the commodification of Titanic started long before it even set sail. When it was first offered to the marketplace as the most luxurious means to cross the Atlantic, it was offered as a commodity, right? And people had shares in it. And it continued after it sank to be a commodity, but a spectacularized one of death and tragedy immediately after it sank. Those elements were commoditized. Vinolia soap, toilet soap, was available on the ship. And before, you know, in the lead up, the year before the ship launched, it was on sale with the image of the Titanic on it. So it started very, very early. A travel insurance company after the disaster exploited the tragedy's resonance in cultural memory to sell policies in 1912. Well, the film, Saved from the Titanic, based on the story of actress Dorothy Gibson, who survived the disaster, was in the cinemas 1 month after the disaster. Numerous film versions of the disaster have been produced, including Titanic, a World War II German propaganda film that said, you know, the British, they're such fools, they can't do anything, the ship, you know, that kind of thing. And then A Night to Remember, of course, famously in 1958, and most commercially successful of all these projects was Titanic by James Cameron in '97, but it also kind of gave birth to other films. It was the inspiration, apparently, for a pornographic representation entitled Titanic. So it just, everything after that film, there are all kinds of attempts to kind of cash in. At this point, I want to turn to the interactivity of popular culture and 2 commercial role-playing games. The 1976 ideal board game, The Sinking of the Titanic, which I played as a kid and might explain my interest, and the 1996 computer game Titanic, Adventure Out of Time. Before I consider the final sites of Spectrality, the first-class dinner party phenomenon, which you might have heard of, and the Swiss Titanic DNA timepiece, and also the Memorial Cruise. The practices of remembering and forgetting that marked the National Maritime Museum exhibit structure both the games and work toward rewriting history, or in Roland Barthes' terms, deforming the myth of Titanic that encodes preferred worlds and nightmare scenarios. So the board game is designed for ages 8 through adult. And the ideal board game, it consists of 3 pieces. So 2 boards representing the ocean that are intersected and joined together by a disc with images of Titanic in one hemisphere and the Carpathia in the other. Players assume the roles of ship's officers, rescuing passengers and securing food and water for the lifeboats as the ship sinks. And you roll the dice and you keep sinking the ship and killing people. Eventually, you sink the ship, and this causes the Carpathia to emerge on the other end of the disc for the rescue of survivors. The first player to reach the Carpathia with rescued passengers wins the game. Before rescue, however, players take part in a sea adventure. In lifeboats or an island adventure, should they wash up on one of the North Atlantic tropical islands that dot the playing surface of the board. Here we have a remembering that is forgetting in its representation of the chilly North Atlantic that took so many lives as a sultry, hot zone. This tension between forgetting and remembering is signaled in the conflicting images that appear on the exterior of the board game box. A naturalistic painting of survivors in a lifeboat, rowing away from the sinking vessel, and the cartoon aesthetic of the board, passenger cards, sea adventure cards, and island adventure cards. The passenger cards offer cartoon caricatures of the British class system in Major Bull and Lord Upton, and the American class system in John Jacob Fitz, a reference to John Jacob Astor. Steerage passengers, however, disappear, only to return as abject ethnic caricatures: Siegfried Fraud, German, Long Fong, Chinese, and Frank Gigolo, Italian. In this spectral Titanic, passengers don't perish from drowning, hypothermia, or the crush of wreckage as they did in 1912, but from tangling with an octopus in a sea adventure or at the hands of North Atlantic cannibals. The traumatic deaths of April 14, 1912 are sugar-coated, domesticated into symbolic order of a children's survival game, a cartoon universe. Players assuming the roles of the ship's officers cannot die, but are disciplined by the rules of the game to engage in the pleasure of watching others lose or expire. To produce their spectral Titanic, the designers of Titanic, Adventure Out of Time, they use animated digital photo representations. So we're talking a different kind of board game here. It's no longer just, piece of cardboard. You get to in 3D, not 3D, but as many dimensions as you can through your computer at the time. So actors in period costume deliver dialogue with these digital photo representations. So these are the kind of characters you meet throughout your time on board the ship. In the automated sequences where the ship sinks, death is certainly not shied away from here. There is more realism. There are virtual corpses visibly floating amidst the underwater wreckage. Not dissimilar to the ideal board game, however, the player of this computer game is extended the voyeuristic pleasure of watching death, but cannot die herself. This virtual reality, however, does work to domesticate the trauma of death that is Titanic by misrecognizing it as a murder mystery and mapping geopolitical value onto the disaster. Upon entering the game world, the player assumes the role of a disgraced British secret agent living during the Blitz in 1942. The player learns that the agent was dismissed from the Secret Service because of a failed mission on board the Titanic that not only could have saved the ship from the iceberg, but also could have prevented both World War I and World War II and the rise of Soviet communism. Again, who knew? When a bomb explodes near the agent's London flat, that's you as the player is transported 30 years back in time into a stateroom on the Titanic for an opportunity to refashion history. Depending on the player's ability to negotiate successfully various puzzles and characters on the ship, she will return to an idealized 1942. If, however, the player fails in her mission and the Titanic sinks, she will return to a number of nightmare 1942s, ranging from a Nazi-occupied England to a communist England. So, by saving the Titanic and foiling Serbian nationalists and German intelligence operatives, the outbreak of World War I is averted, as is the rise of the Third Reich, the communist revolution in Tsarist Russia, and of course, all the people on the Titanic don't die, they live. We've tracked the spectral return of Titanic in cultural sites ranging from journalism to museum exhibits, board game, and computer game. I want to now consider another site of return, the dinner party, which are ubiquitous the last 20 years, to consider the signifying practices of individuals who import Titanic into their own social interactions. The fairly recent, and I think predominantly a bourgeois phenomenon of the Titanic party dates from at least 1997 and the publication of Rick Archbold's and Dana McCauley's book, Last Dinner on the Titanic, which details the ingredients and preparation required to reproduce the last meal served on Titanic's first-class dining saloon. Clearly, the privileging of the final meal by Archbold and McCauley stems from its proximity to the death that came to many of the diners hours later. Robert Hewson's review of the book refers to it, quote, as an obscene project in bad taste, close quote. Touching on the remembering and forgetting of death that is an integral part of all the returns of Titanic we've looked at thus far, Hewson asks, but how many complete this reenactment of what the authors call a great moment in history by going off and drowning themselves in freezing water, close quote. Once again, in this spectral return of Titanic, we have a voyeuristic spectacle of death, a commerce with ghosts that one can survive. Participants in these dinners are consuming class as it is made material in food. The 8-course first-class menu is selected out from a field of possibilities that include the second and third-class menus, but of course they're not present. A recent internet search indicates that there continues to be an appetite for the experience with mail-order home dinner packages offered for sale, as well as a dinner theatre in Melbourne, Australia, that restages the disaster every night, offering both steerage and first-class menus that bear no resemblance, of course, to the meal served on the historical Titanic. Significantly, the dinner theatre's homepage states, quote, survival is guaranteed, and so is a good time, close quote. For an alternative reenactment of what Hewson reads as an obscene project of the Titanic dinner party, I want to shift context to go to Canada. Given that ships from Halifax recovered most of the dead from the Atlantic, that some of those recovered bodies are interred in the city's cemetery, and that 130 Canadians were passengers on board the Titanic, Canada has a long association with the disaster. In the late 90s, the Titanic made a spectral return to Canada, not to the East Coast, but to the Canadian prairie, in the form of dinner reenactments staged to benefit community development. On June 19, 1997, a dinner was held in Red Deer to raise money for local soccer and gymnastics equipment, while another was held in Regina as a fundraiser for the deaf and hard of hearing, and yet another in Calgary. Guests dressed formally or in period costume assumed the identities of first-class passengers. The Red Deer event, which raised $74,000, had the support of the mayor, sponsorship from local businesses, and the participation of local school children and dance groups. School children were involved directly in the commodification of Titanic, painting large sepia-toned images of the ship on tapestries that were then autographed by Millvina Dean, the youngest survivor of the disaster, and this event's sign of authenticity. The tapestries were auctioned off for $2,500 each. Local dance troupes provided Celtic dancing for the obligatory steerage party that began immediately following the first-class meal. This reenactment of 14 April 1912 misrecognizes Titanic as a celebratory evening, generating a deformed, simulated body of Titanic that does not mark the return of the wreck from the North Atlantic so much as it does the return of James Cameron's Ship of Dreams from Hollywood. Cameron's simulated Titanic is, of course, how most of the participants remember the ship, by forgetting the ship and taking the film up as their cultural memory. As the coordinates for remembering are Cameron's, the success of the event, of the participants' ability to make identifications with Titanic and its passengers, is dependent on fostering a sustainable relationship between the film set and the decor the organizers cloaked the Red Deer Hotel in for the evening. To this end, the organizers decorate the hall with poster images from the film and install white wooden superstructure. Book a singer who performs the Celine Dion soundtrack hit, My Heart Will Go On, and arrange for the display of a facsimile of the Heart of the Ocean jewel worn by Rose in the film. So these efforts attempt to mirror the set pieces of Cameron's film, even though there's also this attempt to bring in real history by bringing in a real survivor. Which is, I think, interesting. At one point, organizers, in consultation with the hotel management where it was held, considered flooding the basement, which was to be the setting for the steerage party. They were going to flood it with 250 gallons of water and flicking the lights off and on at 2:20 a.m. to simulate the film's sinking sequence. This didn't happen. The hotel thought it wasn't a good idea. I'm sure their insurance providers also thought that. One of the organizers, Wayne Mcdonald, who played Captain Smith at the event, noted that many of the female participants, quote, rose up on their toes during the Celtic dancing sequence, just like Rose did in the movie. Moreover, he observes, the diners were, quote, wanting to recapture the fantasy of the film, close quote. Mcdonald was instrumental in persuading Millvina Dean to make an appearance at the dinner. And there's Millvina there on the fake set that they've constructed. Now, according to Mcdonald, participants were awestruck by Millvina. So as much as she's competing with these fake sets, but they were awestruck by her in a kind of scary way. She's a living artifact, a survivor who had cheated death, and they were very aggressive in their attempts to touch her, some even taking pieces of hair, buttons and threads from her period costume as souvenirs of their encounter with an authentic piece of Titanic history. Ironically, Millvina Dean, the guarantor of authenticity and the material memory of Titanic, was an infant when she was placed in a lifeboat, and she has no memory of the frosty evening in April 1912, when she lost her brother and father. Now, if Dean was disturbed by the crass commercial exploitation of the Titanic tragedy for profit, in the venture capital projects that sought to rebuild Titanic as a pleasure cruise ship and floating hotel, it would have been interesting to know how she might have viewed Geneva-based watchmaker Romain Gérome's 2009 global campaign to market a high-end timepiece of rusted metal from the twisted wreckage of Titanic to affluent customers. There it is. Aestheticizing the violence of the collision while trading on museological tropes of preservation that the campaign borrows from the Greenwich exhibit and RMS Titanic Incorporated sites of exhibition, Romain Gérome's marketing campaign resurrects the ship not as a mere ghost, but as a material presence of Titanic that's transformed into commodity, complete with a certificate of authenticity from the ship's builders, Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast. However, the watch is simultaneously spectral. Semiotically, it refers back not simply to the Titanic, but specifically to the ship's transformation into a shipwreck, of which it is physical evidence. The advertising images place the watch in a bell jar and inside a frame with shattered glass, marking and preserving the moment of violence in April 1912 to produce wreckage as art object and to engender consumer desire for death that is survivable. As I said, this is Zizek's materialization of the terrifying, yet rehabilitated, contained, and rendered inert to be worn around the wrist as an accessory and a marker of excess capital with a monetary value of US $11,900. Romain Gérome's advertising copy reads in part, quote, "The master watchmakers of Romain Gérome have developed a rust stabilization procedure which protects oxidized timepieces from further corrosion. For a more authentic appearance, the T-Oxy 4, the name of the watch you just saw, ultimate rust with a ravaged design illustrating the final level of oxidization is made possible before decomposition." So the hands that move around the face of the watch mark the mortality of the timepiece's bearer, all the while circling around the thing that has not only survived the death of 1,500 people, but is itself forever frozen on the edge of decomposition. It's taken as far as it can go without falling apart through this great technology. Titanic is always already associated with the excesses of capitalism, as I've already mentioned. And the specific manifestation of Titanic's return at a moment when those very excesses of a deregulated market have placed the global financial system in crisis is, I believe, significant. At once, trauma is transformed into materialized enjoyment. The crisis in the free market has destroyed fortunes, cast some brokers on Wall Street and in the city in London out of their homes and off of their yachts, foreclosed on the homes of the middle classes, but there is still a market for items like the Titanic DNA watch. Articulating his understanding of simulacra and simulations, which is what we've been talking about, and we're coming to a close. Baudrillard writes, quote, "When the real is no longer what it used to be, nostalgia assumes its full meaning." And I think that's largely what we have here. He writes, "There is a proliferation of myths of origin and signs of reality, of secondhand truth, objectivity, and authenticity," close quote. So it's out of this context that the specter of Titanic returns to haunt the social. In the case of the dinners, the fantasy Titanic cruise ships, and the DNA watch, there seems to be nostalgia for a capitalism that afforded a very few the luxury of first-class treatment, a sign of human value that happens so frequently in our consumer culture becomes confused with commodity valuation. One of the diners at a reenactment dinner in Regina told Mcdonald, quote, "I want to thank you for bringing an event to Regina where I feel like I'm a first-class person," close quote. Concomitant with this aura of class privilege, nostalgia surrounding Titanic, anybody been watching Downton Abbey? I think it's a similar kind of product, if you will. And a friend told me, this is probably, I hadn't heard this before, calls it aristo porn. And I think that there's a certain aura of that around some of these products that we've been talking about. So there's this pleasure in consuming death as commodity that structures the returns that we've talked about. The tabloid games, the films, the museum exhibits, the myths of origin that proliferate and stand in for cultural memory when there really is no longer what it used to be. The real has disappeared. In the words of Guy Debord, quote, "Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation." And that representation is cultural memory. Significant to our deliberations about the various attempted restorations of Titanic, its shifting returns in cultural memory, is Roland Barthes' insistence on memory as a key component of myth and its representation, and Heisson's observation that all representation is based on memory. Heisson's work on memory as a process of remembering and forgetting is anticipated by Roland Barthes in 1954, when he writes of myth, quote, "It is a conjuring trick," he says. "It turns reality inside out. It empties reality of history and fills it with nature, or it naturalizes the fabricated narrative of myth, and it stands in for reality." The forgetting component may be located in Barthes' understanding of the conjuring trick as theft. So the displacement of the original, in this case Titanic, by its representations is a form of theft. So the 15 to 33 million people, myself included, who have remembered Titanic through this haunting, the artifacts exhibition, or those who bought tickets to the charity dinners in Alberta and Saskatchewan, or those who purchased the DNA watch, we're all complicit in an invention of cultural memory through a conjuring trick that's predicated on the consumption of commodity forms of the ship. Derrida's consideration of marks and specters seizes on that conjuring trick of spectrality in relation to the ideology of the commodity form. For Derrida and Marx, the market in which commodity forms circulate is, quote, a front among fronts, where these hard-headed specters have commerce among themselves, close quote. And the market is the locus for all the ghosts of Titanic discussed here. To generate a ghost of Titanic for purchasing remembrance, however, there must be, in Derrida's terms, a return to the body, but to a body that is more abstract than ever. This concept is instructive for understanding the workings of cultural memory and the market around the spectral bodies of Titanic cited above. Placing Marx and Stirner in dialogue, Derrida sets about elucidating these conjuring tricks of what he refers to as the spectrogenic process. Bear with me. He calls it the spectrogenic process of incorporation, and that's supposedly what we're doing when we buy tickets, when we participate in these events. Once ideas or thoughts, he writes, are detached from their substratum, one engenders some ghost by giving them a body. Not by returning to the living body from which the ideas and thoughts have been torn loose, but by incarnating the latter in another artificial body, a prosthetic body, a ghost of spirit, one might say a ghost of the ghost, so these layers of hauntings that come back to us. In adapting Derrida's discussion of Marx's spectral poetics to my argument, I'm suggesting that the ideas or thoughts about Titanic are, in the case of Titanic Adventure Out of Time, for example, detached from the unknowable multiple narratives that composed the collective memory of Titanic and its sinking in 1912, and incarnated in the prosthetic body of the digital Titanic, where the ghost ship is imported into a signifying system for remembering the sinking of the White Star Line, but it's bound up with this geopolitical mess about World War I and World War II, and the various, Serbian nationalists, the various strands of the detective mystery and the geopolitical game that it takes on. These specters are then incorporated by the player, just as specters of Titanic generated by RMS Titanic Incorporated, the purveyors of Titanic dinners, the Weekly World News, or Romain Jerome are incorporated by, respectively, the spectating ticket holder, the dinner guest, the tabloid reader, or the wearer of the DNA watch. Apparitions of Titanic are frequently generated in the name of preserving or even restoring cultural memory, while simultaneously, as I mentioned before, they cause it to disappear. For example, in its corporate profile, RMS Titanic states, quote, "It is the company's purpose to preserve the memory of the Titanic and all who sailed with her, and to promote that memory with a respect and regard for the ship's historical and maritime significance," close quote. However, as I've suggested, RMS Titanic's Incorporated emphasizes its emphasis on spectacle and entertainment is at odds with respectful memorialization and frequently aids and abets disappearance. Moreover, ongoing litigation in which the corporation demanded full ownership of the 5,900 artifacts it salvaged under the antiquated maritime rule of finders keepers makes it difficult to reconcile the stated intent to preserve and respect the memory of the ship with the litigation that the United States Court of Appeals judge Paul Niemeyer characterizes as, quote, "but a short step from active piracy and pillaging," close quote. My last site is Arrival in New York, the Centenary cruise. The wreck site was bound to see more commercial traffic, with the 2012 centenary of the ship's sinking prompting an entrepreneurial commemoration of the tragedy in the form of the Miles Morgan Travel and Fred Olson Cruise Line's Titanic Memorial Cruise 100th Anniversary Voyage, which invited consumers to, quote, "reserve your place in history," with tickets ranging from £2,595 to £7,995. It was marketed as following the original itinerary, passing Cherbourg, calling at Cobb, crossing the Atlantic, and arriving at the site of the Titanic sinking for the 14th and 15th April, exactly 100 years from the tragic event. The proposed cruise on the Balmoral was supposed to revisit the tragedy, and there's going to be a memorial service at the site. Following the service, the ship docked in Halifax for an excursion to Fairview Lawn Cemetery, where unclaimed bodies were recovered from the disaster and were interred there. The final port of call was described by Miles Morgan's website in their digital marketing brochure as Titanic's intended destination, New York. This ensured that the 100th anniversary voyage not only tracks the ghost of Titanic, but completes the journey. The White Star Liner began a century earlier. To these ends, the Balmoral became a kind of, that's the ship that actually was the conveyance for this cruise, became a kind of floating memory lab that offered lectures to passengers who were outfitted in an Edwardian costume about life on board Titanic 100 years ago, as the Titanic approached, as the Balmoral approached the place where the Titanic sank. And so there are presentations by experts on the Titanic, different historians, the descendants of people who were actually lost on the Titanic, and wreaths were placed there. So there was this attempt to memorialize those who had been lost. However, the original Miles Morgan itinerary narrative, for all of its references to memorializing the lives lost in 1912, simultaneously evinces a forgetting through the promise to produce new memories of 21st century consumption in New York. Here we admire the glitz, this is a quote from their copy, here we admire the glitz, glamour, and bright lights of the Big Apple, visit one of the city's many museums, shop till you drop, or even take in a Broadway show. Whatever you decide, we are sure that this epic adventure will leave you with no shortage of experiences and memories to talk about. So in this sense, the memorial cruise is, in Derrida's terms, inducing visions through the invitation to consume Titanic as a commodity spectacle. By rendering the Titanic as an online shopping expedition, there's also a site when you went to book your cruise. You could also buy various items as well. And there's also, now that it's over, you can get a memorial medallion that I think at various price ranges and various fine metals. The Titanic Memorial Cruises Balmoral provides one answer to the question I posed earlier about the failed Titanic venture capital shipbuilding projects. When does a death ship resurface in cultural memory as a pleasure cruiser? When you shop till you drop, from excess consumption, not hypothermia or drowning. In the second iteration of the PDF brochure, they pulled this because people thought it was offensive. This egregious line, shop till you drop, is removed. That happened about 2 months after it was up. So the Balmoral, not unlike memory itself, promised to serve as a vehicle for time travel, but remained a conjuring trick performed by the travel agencies that developed it. And actually worked to disappear Titanic while offering access to the spectral body of Titanic through the physical body of Balmoral. So there's those various bodies where people are trying to get access to the ship that's actually at the bottom. All cultural memories of Titanic are trips back in time, taken from the locus of the now, which is itself constructed from mediated memories of the past that work to neutralize the violent eruption of Titanic's reel into a symbolic order that's structured by games, holiday cruises, entertainments, accessories, and in this manner, they tell us more about their moment of return than they do of the historical past they conjure to make Titanic present in any given cultural moment. I'm sorry it went on so long. It's over.